This is A Death in the Desert by Willa Cather. Windermere Hillgrade was conscious that the man in the seat across the aisle was looking at him intently. He was a large, florid man, wore a conspicuous diamond solitaire upon his third finger, and Windermere judged him to be a traveling salesman of sort. He had the air of an adaptable fellow who had been about the world and who could keep cool and clean under almost any circumstances. The High Line Flyer, as this train was decisively called among the railroad men, was jerking along through the hot afternoon over the monotonous country between Haldrig and Cheyenne. Besides the blond man and himself, the only occupants of the car were two dusty, bedraggled-looking girls who had been at the exposition at Chicago, and who were earnestly discussing the cost of their first trip out of Colorado. The four uncomfortable passengers were covered with a sentiment of fine yellow dust, which clung to their hair and eyebrows like gold powder. It blew up in clouds from the bleak, lifeless country through which they passed, until they were one color with the sagebrush and sand hills. The gray and yellow desert was varied only by occasional ruins of the deserted towns, and the little red boxes of station houses, where the spindling trees and sickly vines in the bluegrass yards were kept alive only by the continual hydroponic injections of water from the tank where the engines were watered. Little green reserves fenced off in that confusing wilderness of sand. As the slanting rays of the sun beat in stronger and stronger through the car windows, the blond gentleman asked the lady's permission to remove his coat and sat in his lavender-striped shirt sleeves, with a black silk handkerchief tucked carefully about his collar. He had seemed interested in Windermere since they boarded the train at Haldridge, and kept glancing at him curiously and then looking reflectively out the window as though he was trying to recall something. But whenever Windermere went, someone was also sure to look at him with curious intent, and it had ceased to embarrass or annoy him. Presently the stranger seemed satisfied with his observation, leaned back in his seat, half closed his eyes, and began softly to whistle the spring song from Proserpine, the cantata that a dozen years before had made him its young famous composer in a night. Windermere had heard that air on the guitars in old Mexico, on mandolins at college glees, and cottage organs in New England hamlets. And only 2 weeks ago he had heard it played on sleigh bells at the Verdi Theater in Denver. There was certainly no way of escaping his brother's prosperity. Adrian's could live on the other side of the Atlantic, where his youthful indiscretions were forgotten in his mature achievements, but his brother had never been able to outrun Proserpine, and here he found it again in Colorado sandhills. Not that Windermere was exactly ashamed of Proserpine, only a man of genius could have written it, but it was the sort of thing that a man of genius outgrows as soon as he can, and its popularity was the gravest charge conservative critics could make against it. Windermere unbent a trifle and smiled at his neighbor across the aisle. Immediately the large man rose, and becoming over-drooped in his seat facing Hildred, extended his card. "Dusty ride, isn't it? I don't mind it myself. I'm used to it. Born and bred in a deer-briar patch in like Beer Rabbit. I've been trying to place you for a long time. I think I must have met you before." Thank you, said Windermere, taking his card. My name is Hilgred. You probably met my brother, Aderance. People often mistake me for him. The traveling man brought his hand down upon his knee with such reverence that the solitaire blazed. So I was right after all. And if you're not Aldrich Hilgrade, you're his double. I thought I couldn't be mistaken. Seen him, well, I guess. I've never missed one of his recitals at the auditorium. And he played the piano score of Proserpine through to us once in Chicago Press Club. I used to be on the commercial there before I began to travel from publishing department of the concern. So you're Hilgred's brother, and here I run into you at the jumping off place. Sounds like a paper yarn, doesn't it? The traveling man laughed and offered Windermere a cigar and piled him with questions on the only subject that people ever seemed to care to talk about Windermere about. At length, the salesman and the two girls alighted at the Chicago way station, and Windermere went on to Cheyenne alone. The train pulled into Cheyenne at 9 o'clock, late by the matter of 4 or so, but no one seemed particularly concerned about its tardiness, except the station agent, who grumbled at being kept at the office over time on a summer night. When Windermere alighted from the train, he walked down the platform and stopped at the track, crossing, uncertain as to what direction he should take to reach a hotel. A phaeton stood near the crossing, and a woman held the reins. She was dressed in white, and her figure was clearly silhouetted against the cushions, though it was too dark to see her face. Windermere had scarcely noticed her when the switch engine came puffering up from the opposite direction, and the headlight threw a strong glare of light on his face. Suddenly the woman in the phaeton uttered a low cry and dropped the reins. Windermere started forward and caught the horse's head, but the animal only lifted its ears and whisked its tail in impatient surprise. The woman sat perfectly still, her head sunk between her shoulders, and her handkerchief pressed on her face. Another woman came out of the depot and hurried toward the phaeton, crying, "Catherine, dear, what is the matter?" Windermere hesitated in a moment in painful embarrassment, then lifted his hat and passed on. He was accustomed to the sudden recognitions in the most impossible places, especially by women, but this cry out of the night had shaken him. While Windermere was breakfasting the next morning, the head waiter leaned over his chair and murmured that there was a gentleman wanting to see him in the parlor. Windermere finished his coffee and went in the direction indicated, where he found his visitor relentlessly pacing the floor. His whole manner betrayed a high degree of nervous agitation, though his physique was not that of a man whose nerves lie near the surface. He was something below medium height, square-shouldered and silently built. His thick, closely cut hair was beginning to show gray about his ears, and his bronzed face was heavily lined. His square brown hands were locked behind him, and he held his shoulders like a man conscious of responsibilities, yet, as he turned to greet Windermere, there was incurious defiance in his address. "Good morning, Mr. Hilgrade," he said, extending his hand. "I found your name on the hotel registry. My name is Gaylord, and I'm afraid my sister startled you at the station last night. Mr. Hilgrade and I have come to apologize." "Ah, the young lady in the phaeton. I am sure I didn't know whether I had anything to do with her alarm or not. If I did, it is I who owe you the apology, and make it to you most sincerely." The man colored a little under the dark brown face. "Oh, it's nothing you could help, sir. I fully understand that. You see, my sister used to be a pupil of your brother's, and it seems you favor him, and when the switch engine threw a light on your face, it startled her." Windermere wheeled about in his chair. "Oh, Catherine Gaylord, is it possible? Now it's you who have given me a turn. Why, I used to know her when I was a boy. What on earth is she doing here? Said Gaylord, grimly filling out the pause. You've got at the heart of the matter. You knew my sister had been in bad health for a long time. No, I had never heard word of it. The last I knew, she was singing in London. My brother and I correspond infrequently, and seldom get beyond family matters. I am deeply sorry to hear this. There are many reasons why I should be more concerned than I tell you. The lines of Charles Gaylord's brow relaxed a little. What I'm trying to say, Mr. Hilgard, is that she wants to see you. I hate to ask you, but she's set on it. We live several miles out of town, but my rig's below, and I can take you out any time you go. I can go now, and it will give me real pleasure to do so, said Windermere quickly. I'll get my hat, and I'll be with you in a moment. When he came downstairs, Windermere found a cart at the door, and Charlie Gaylord drew a long sigh of relief as he gathered up the reins and settled back into his own element. You see, I think I'd better tell you something about my sister before you see her, and I don't know just where to begin. She traveled in Europe with your brother and his wife and sang at a lot of his concerts, and I don't know just how much you know about her. Very little, except my brother always thought her the most gifted of his pupils, and that when I knew her she was very young and very beautiful, and turned my head sadly for a while. Windermere saw that Gaylord's mind was quite engrossed by his grief. He was wrought up to the point where his reserve and sense of proportion had quite left him, and his trouble was one vital thing in the world. That's the whole thing, he went on, flicking his horses with the whip. She's a great woman. She was a great woman, as you say, and she didn't come from a great family. She had to fight her own way from the first. She got to Chicago, then to New York, and then to Europe, where she went up like lightning and got a taste for it all. And now she's dying here like a rat in a hole, out of her own world, and she can't fall back into ours. We've grown apart some way, miles and miles apart, and I'm afraid she's fearfully unhappy. It's a very tragic story that you're telling, are telling, Gaylord, said Windermere. They were well out of the country now, spinning along the dusty plains of red grass and the ragged blue outline of the mountains before them. Tragic, cried Gaylord, starting up in his seat. My God, man, nobody will ever know how tragic. It's a tragedy. I live with it, I eat with it, I sleep with it, until I lost my grip on everything. You see, she had made a good bit of money, but she spent it all going to health resorts. It's her lungs, you know. I've got money enough to send her anywhere, but the doctors say it's no use. She hasn't the ghost of a chance. It's just getting through the days until the end now. I had no notion she was half so bad before she came here. She just wrote that she was all run down. Now that she's here, I think she'd be better, happier anywhere under the sun, but she won't leave. She says it's easier to let go of life here, and that to go east would be dying twice. There was a time when I was a brakeman with a run out of Bird City, Iowa, and she was a little thing I would carry on my shoulder, and when I could get her everything on earth she wanted, and she hadn't a wish my 80 a month didn't cover. And now, when I've got a little property together, I can't buy her a night's sleep. He stopped with a gulp and half closed his eye. Windermere saw that whatever Charlie Gaylord's present status in the world might be, he had brought the brakeman's heart up the ladder with him, and the brakeman's frank atoll of settlement. Presently Gaylord went on. You can understand how she outgrew her family. We were all pretty common sort, railroaders from way back. My father was a conductor. He died when we were kids. Maggie, my older sister, who lives with me, was a telegraph operator here. while I was getting my grips on things. We had no education to speak of. I have to hire a stenographer because I can't spell straight. The Almighty couldn't teach me to spell. The things that make up life to Kate are all Greek to me. That's scarcely the point where we touch anymore, except in our recollections of old times when we were all young and happy together, and Kate sang in a church choir in Bird City. But believe me, Mr. Hildred, if she can see just one person like you, who knows about things, and people she cares for, it would give her about the only comfort she can have. The rein slackened in Charles Gaylord's hand as they drew up slope before the showily painted house, with many gables and a round tower. Here we are, he said, turning to Windermere, and I guess we understand each other. They were met at the door by a thin, colorless woman whom Gaylord introduced as my sister Maggie. She asked her brother to show Mr. Hildred into the music room, where Catherine wished to see him alone. When Windermere entered the music room, he gave a little start of surprise, feeling that he had stepped from the glaring Wyoming sunset into some New York studio they had always known. He wondered which it was of those countless studios high up under the roofs, over the banks and shops, and the wholesale houses, that this room resembled, and he looked incredulously out of the window as the great plain that ended in the great upheaval of the Rockies. There are little skeleton closets of art scattered here and there all over the West, where some might have been hides his memories and trophies of his student days on the continent, and the rusty tools of a craft that he once believed he called him. But this room savored from the present, and about it there was an air of immediate touch with the art of the present. On the walls were autograph sketches by several of the younger American painters and young Scotchmen whose names were scarcely known on this side of the water. Above one of the bookcases was a large photograph of Rodin Blades, a music rack where the scores of Musset's latest opera and Camade's latest song. It seemed scarcely possible that this glad tidings of these things should have reached Wyoming already. The haunting air of familiarity about the place perplexed Windermere. Was the room a copy of some particular studio he knew, or was it merely the studio atmosphere that seemed so individual and pointedly resembling here in Wyoming? He sat down in a reading chair and looked keenly about him. Suddenly his eyes fell upon a large photograph of his brother, framed in dark wood above the piano. Then it all became clear to him. This was veritably his brother's room, if it were not an exact copy of one of the studios that Adrian's had fitted up in various parts of the world, wearying of them and leaving almost before the renovator's varnish had dried. It was at least in the same tone. In every detail, Adrian's taste was so magnificent that the room seemed to exhale his personality. The black oak ceiling and floor, the dull red walls, the huge brick fireplace with a Wagerton inscription on the tiles, the old Venetian lamp that hung under the copy of the Mona Lisa, the cast of the Brythonian frieze that ran about the room, and the tall brass candlesticks with their scarodol candles were all exactly as Adrian's would have had them. Among the photographs on the wall, there was one of Catherine Gaylord, taken in the days when Windermere had known her, and when the flash of her eye or the flutter of her skirt was enough to set his boyish heart in tumult. Even now he stood before the portrait with a certain degree of embarrassment. It was the face of a woman already old in her first youth, thoroughly sophisticated and a trifle hard, and it told of what her brother had called her fright. The comrade of frank, confident eyes, and was qualified in the deep lines above her mouth and the curve of her lip, which was both sad and cynical. Certainly she had a good more will than confidence towards the world, and the bravado of her smile could not conceal the shadow of an unrest that was almost discontent. Perhaps that, too, was only the scar of the struggle of which her brother had spoken. Perhaps the long warfare against adverse conditions had brought among an almost antagonistic and distrustful attitude of the mind. The chief charm of the woman, as Windermere had known her, lay in a superb figure in her eyes, which possessed a warm, life-giving quality that the sunset, generous, fearless eyes had glowed with sympathy and good cheer for all living things, a sort of perpetual tumult to the world. Her head, Winter remembered, was particularly well-shaped and proudly posed. There had been always a little of the imprex about her, and her pose in the photo revealed all of his impressions of her unattachedness, of her absolutely stood alone. Windermere was still standing before the picture, his eyes behind him and his head inclined, where he heard the door open. A very tall woman advanced towards him, holding out her hand. As she started to speak, she coughed slightly, then laughing said in a low, rich voice, a trifle husky, "You see, I make the traditional Camille entrance with a cough. How good of you to come, Mr. Hildebrand." Windermere was acutely conscious that while addressing him, she was not looking at him at all, and as he assured her of the pleasure of coming in, he was glad to have the opportunity to collect himself. He had not reckoned on the ravages of a long illness. The long, loose folds of her white gown had been especially designed to disguise the sharp outlines of her emaciated body, but the stamp of her disease was there, simple and ugly and obtrusive, a pitiless fact that could not be disguised nor evaded. The splendid shoulders were stooped. There was swaying uneasiness in her gait. Her arms seemed disproportionately long, and her hands were transparently white and cold to the touch as water flowers. Her chest, that full, proud, singing chest that swelled like bellows of an organ when she took her high notes, was fallen and flat. The changes in her face were less obvious. The proud carriage of her head, the warm, clear eyes, even the delicate flush of her color in her cheeks, all defiantly remained, though they were all in a low key, older, sadder, softer. She sat down upon the divan and began nervously arranging the pillows. "I know I'm not inspiring object to look upon, but you must be quite frank and sensible about that, and get used to it at once, for we've no time to lose. And if I'm a trifle irritable, you wouldn't mind, for I am more than usual nervous." "Don't bother with me this morning if you're tired," urged Windermere. "I can come quite as well tomorrow." "Gracious, no," she protested, with a flash of that was quick, keen humor that he remembered as part of her. "It's solitude that I'm tired to death of. Solitude and the wrong kind of people. You see, the minister, not content with reading prayers for the sick, called on me this morning. He happened to be riding by on his bike and felt it was his duty to stop. Of course he disapproves of my profession, and I think he takes it for granted that I have a dark past. The funniest feature of his conversation is that he is always excusing my own vocation to me, condoning it, you know, and trying to patch up my peace with my conscience by suggesting possible notable uses for what he kindly calls my talent." Windermere laughed. "Oh, I'm afraid I'm not the person to call after such a serious gentleman. I can't sustain the situation. At my best, I don't reach higher than low comedy. Have you decided to which one of the noble uses you will devote yourself?" Catherine lifted her hands in a gesture to recount, and then went on. "I'm not equal to any of them, not even to the least noble. I didn't study the method. Neither Maturin or your brother taught me the moral purpose of singing the scales." Catherine laughed indulgently. "The parson's not so bad. His English never offends me, And he has read Gibbon's Decline and Fall, all 5 volumes, and that's something. Then he has been to New York, and that's a great deal. But how are we losing time? Don't tell me about New York, Charlie says you're just on from there. How does it look and taste and smell just now? I think of a whiff of the Jersey ferry would be as flagons of cod liver oil to me. Who conspicuously walks the right toe now, and what does he or she wear? Are the trees still green in Madison Square, or have they grown brown and dusty? Does the chasey Diana on the Garden Theater still keep her vessel vows through all the aspirating changes of the weather? Who was her brother's studio now? And who misguided aspirants practice their scales in the ricketies above Carnegie Hall? What do people go to see at the theaters? And what do they eat and drink there in the world nowadays? You see, I loved it all, from the Battery to the Riverside, and let me die in Harlem. She interrupted by a violent attack of coughing. Windermere, embarrassed by her discomfort, plunged into gossip about the professional people he had met in town during the summer and the musical outlook for winter. He was diagramming with a pencil on the back of an old envelope he found in his pocket. Some new mechanical device that was used in the Metropolitan in the theater of Reginald, when he became conscious that she was looking at him intently, and that he was talking to 4 walls. Catherine was lying back among the pillows, watching him with half-closed eyes. As a painter looks at a picture, he finished with his explanation vaguely enough and put the envelope back in his pocket, and as he did so, she quietly said, "How wonderfully like Adrian's you are," and he felt as though a crisis of some sort had been met and tided over. He laughed, looking up at her with a touch of pride in his eyes that made them seem quite boyish. "Yes, isn't it absurd? It's almost as awkward as looking at Napoleon. There's no possibility of living up to the part. I really believe it kept me out of a scrape or 2 when I was in college. And after all, there are some advantages. It has made some of his friends like me. I hope it will make you." Catherine smiled and gave him a quick, meaningful glance from under her lashes. "Oh, it did that long ago. What a haughty, reserved youth you were then, and how you used to stare at people and then blush and look across if they paid you back in your own coin. Do you remember the night when you took me home from rehearsal and scarcely spoke a word to me?" "It was the silence of admiration," protested Windermere. "Very crude and boyish, but very sincere and not a little painful. Perhaps you suspected something of the sort. I remember you saw fit to be very grown up and worldly. I believe I suspected a pose, and the one that college boys usually affect with singers. An earthen vessel in love with a star, you know. But it would rather surprise me in you, for you must have seen a good deal of your brother's pupils, or you had the omnibus capacity and elasticity that always met with occasion." "Don't ask a man to confess the follies of his youth," said Windermere, smiling a little sadly. "I am sensitive about some of them even now, but I was not so sophisticated as you imagined. I saw my brother's pupils come and go, but that was about all. Sometimes I called on to play accompaniments, or to fill out a vacancy at a rehearsal, or to order a carriage for an infuriated soprano who had thrown up her part. But they never spent any time with me unless it was to notice the resemblance you speak of." "Yes," observed Catherine thoughtfully, "I noticed it then too, but it has grown as you have grown older. That is rather strange when you have lived such different lives. It's not merely an ordinary family likeness of feature, you know, but a sort of interchangeable individuality, the suggestion of another man's personality in your face, like an air transposed to another key. But I'm not attempting to define it. It's beyond me. Something altogether unusual and trifle, well, uncanny," she finished, laughing. I remember, Windermere said, seriously twirling the pencil between his fingers and looking as he sat with his head thrown back out under the red window blind, which was raised just a little as it flung back and forth in the wind, revealed the glaring panorama of the desert, a blinding stretch of yellow, flat as the sea in a dead calm, splotched here and there with deep purple shadows, and beyond the ragged blue outline of the mountains and the peaks of the snow, white as the white clouds. I remember when I was a little fellow, I used to be very sensitive about it. I don't think it exactly pleased me, or that I would have had it otherwise if I could, but it seemed to me like a birthmark, or something not to be lightly spoken of. People were naturally always fonder of Ad than me, and I used to feel the chill of reflected light pretty often. It affected even my relationships with my mother. Ad went abroad to study when he was absurdly young, and my mother was all broken up over it. She did her whole duty by each of us, but it was sort of generally understood among us that she had made burnt offerings of us all for Addie any day. It was a little fellow then, and when she sat alone on the porch in the summer dusk, she used to sometimes call me to her and turn her face up in the light that streamed out of the shutters and kiss me, and then I always knew she was thinking of Adderns. Poor little chap, said Catherine. Her tone was a trifle huskier than usual. How fond people have always been of Adderns. Now tell me the latest news on him. I haven't heard, except through the press, for a year or more. He was in Algiers then, in the Valley of Chef, riding horseback night and day in the Arabian costume, and in his usual enthusiastic fashion he had quite made up his mind to adopt the Mohammedan faith and become as nearly an Arab as possible. How many countries and faiths has he adopted, I wonder? Probably he was playing Arab to himself all the time. I remember when he was a 16th century duke in Florence once for 4 weeks together. Oh, that's Adderns, chuckled Windermere. He is himself barely long enough to write checks and be measured for his clothes. I didn't hear from him for a while. Was he an Arab? I missed that. Well, he had a piano carted out into the desert somehow, and was living in a tent beside a dried water course grown up with dwarf Orlanders. He was writing an Algerine suite for the piano then. It must be in the publisher's hands by this time. I have been too ill to answer his letter, and I've lost touch with him. Algerine drew a letter from his pocket. This came a month ago. It's chiefly about his new opera, which is to be brought to London next winter. Read it at your leisure. I think I shall keep it as hostage, so that I may be sure you will come again. Now I want you to play for me, whatever you like. But if there is anything new in the world, in mercy, let me hear it. For 9 months I've heard nothing but the baggage coach ahead, and she's my baby's mother. He sat down at the piano, and Catherine sat next to him, observed a remarkable physical likeness to his brother, and trying to discover in just what it consisted. Windermere was not even a handsome man. Everyone admitted that his brother was. Catherine told himself that it was very much as a sculptor's finished work had been rudely copied in wood. He was of a larger build than Adderns, and his shoulders were broad and heavy, while those of his brother were slender and rather girlish. His face was of the same oval mold, but it was gray and darkened about by the mouth by the continual shaving. His eyes were of the same inconsistent April color, but they were reflective and rather dull. What Adderns were always points of high light, and always meaning another thing than the thing they meant yesterday. But it was hard to see why this earnest man should so continually suggest the lyric, youthful face that was as gay as his grave. For Adrian's, though he was 10 years older, and though his hair was streaked with silver, had the face of a boy of 20, so mobile that it told his thoughts before he could put them into words or music, and responded to the nerve centers of his sensitive brain as the keyboard to touch. Famous for extravagance of her vocal methods and her affections, had one said to him that the shepherd boy who sang under the oaks of the Vale Temp must certainly have looked like young Hildred, and the comprehension had been appropriated by 100-shire women who preferred to quote. As Windermere sat smoking on the veranda of the Inner Ocean House that night, he was the victim of random recollections. His infatuation for Catherine Gaylord, visionaries as it was, had been the most serious of his boyhood love affairs, and had long disturbed his bachelor dreams. He was painfully timid in everything in relation to emotions, and his heart had withdrawn with him from the society of women. The fact that it was all so done and dead and far behind him, that the woman had lived her life out since then, gave me a prescient sense of age and loss. He bethought himself of something that Stevenson had said sitting by the hearth, and remembering the face of a woman without desire, and felt himself an Octogenarian. He remembered how bitter and morose he had grown during his stay at his brother's studio when Catherine Gaylord was working there, and how he wounded Adrian's on the night of his last concert in New York. He sat there in the box while his brother and Catherine were called back again and again after the last number, watching the roses go up over the footlights until they stacked half-high on the piano, brooding in his sullen boyhood heart upon the pride those two felt in each other's work, surprising each other to their best and beautiful contending in song, as he had read in some Greek lyric. The floodlights had seemed a hard glittering line, drawn sharply between life and his, a circle of flame set about those splendid children of genius. He walked back to his hotel alone, and sat in the window staring out at Madison Square until long after midnight, resolving to beat no more at the doors that could never enter, and realizing more keenly than ever before how far this glorious dream world of production and beautiful creations lay beyond the prow of the merchant marines. He told himself that he had in common with this woman only the rare uses of life, that the sixth sense of passion for perfect expression and the luster of her achievement were like a rosy mist veiling her, such as a goddess of elder days wrapped about themselves when they vanish from the arms of men. Okay, that's part one, and in the second recording, I'm going to record part two.